On March 2nd, 1965, the United States commenced a restricted but massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam, intended to place increasing pressure on the North Vietnamese leadership to negotiate a peaceful settlement to the war. The last such mission took place on August 15, 1973, by which time more than 6.3 million tons of bombs had been dropped on Indochina, roughly 3 times the number dropped on both theaters during World War II. World War II had shown dramatically that air power was one of the keys to victory in war, and barely 5 years later, the Korean conflict reaffirmed the idea. So it was that when the United States first established a military mission to the armed forces of the newly created Republic of South Vietnam, the Air Force had a prominent role. In the days and years that followed, the United States Air Force's commitment to the war in Vietnam grew to unimagined levels. However, Southeast Asia was a less than ideal area for the application of air power. Triple canopy jungle, mountainous terrain, and unsuitable weather conditions were just some of the things that limited the effectiveness of airstrikes.
In many cases, you could not see the target, quite frankly. The canopy was so thick there that, in a lot of cases, bombing a spot. I flew 200 missions there, and in all those missions, I actually saw something on the ground that it was a target I was sure of maybe a dozen times.
Despite the obvious problems, the United States Air Force was soon involved in every aspect of the war. Using a variety of transport aircraft, big and small, the Air Force delivered all sorts of cargo. Strategic airlift was used to fly soldiers and whole units into the war zone, while the smaller planes of tactical airlift would fly them from place to place within the country. Air supply was essential to the U.S. war effort in Vietnam because supply by ground routes was often extremely dangerous or even impossible due to enemy action. As the Air Force and U.S. involvement grew, so too did the need for air bases and facilities within Southeast Asia. The Air Force undertook a rapid and massive building program which included runways, hangars, fuel dumps, bomb dumps, barracks, and other facilities as well. American air bases were priority targets for Viet Cong and NVA rocket, mortar, and sapper attacks throughout the war.
I remember one day we underwent a rocket and mortar attack, and the stuff came raining in, so we all got in slit trenches, but we could see right away that they weren't aimed for our part of the base where the quarters were. They were aimed for the airplanes, which is exactly what they should have done. So I thought, God, I've got 6 little airplanes down there, so I better go and check them. So I jumped in a Jeep and ran off, and by that time it was over, and I rounded the corner of a revetment, and there was a skydiver there, an A-1, loaded with bombs and burning. They'd hit it direct. And I thought, God, I oughtn't to be here, and I was right. Something exploded right that time and moved my Jeep sideways just from the blast, and something went right by me and took the rear view, or the side view mirror off right in front of my nose. And I said, yeah, I was sure right. I shouldn't have been there, but, it wasn't my day, so it really didn't make that much difference, I guess.
To assist in defense of its facilities, the Air Force expanded the training of its internal security forces. Yet when the NVA launched the Tet Offensive, base security forces were barely able to cope with the fury of the assaults.
The air police are the ones that took a lot of the brunt of the attack, and then there was also an Army unit that was off the perimeter of the base that took a lot of the brunt. And it was enough to slow the things down that we were able to recover. They were able to get the gunships up in the air, because the base was the home for what we call the Razorback gunships. So they were able to get a lot of the Hueys up in the air. And they also had enough time to bring Puff the Magic Dragon down. And Puff had the C-47 that had 3 miniguns mounted inside its windows. Each one of the miniguns could put out about 6,000 rounds a minute. And when Puff would come in, it would tip its wing and it lay off a roll of fire, and it'd just basically be a solid line or red line of tracers coming to the ground. Having been able to bring in the firepower and delay of the attack coming up the Cholon district pretty much helped save Tonsilton from actually being. I don't think the base would have been overrun, but it would have been breached.
Initially, the enemy attacks were very successful, and the damage done to U.S. forces and installations was extensive.
An aircraft fully loaded, its designation became known as an above-ground, unbarricaded magazine. Now, if anybody had said that prior to the Tet, when they took out our flight line, we wouldn't know what it meant. It wouldn't have meant anything. But when you see a row of aircraft, 30, 40 in a line, all fully loaded, with no barricades, no restriction, quantity distance was waived. In the States, you would have parked that many airplanes that close together. But we were short on ramp space. Even though the ramp was enormous, there was a lot of airplanes there. And we commented that, boy, if one of those airplanes goes, they're all going to go. And they did. But it just gave you an idea of, under combat conditions, how we can get ourselves to accept these kinds of conditions as, well, it's war, so we'll just go ahead and do it. We learned the hard way. You cannot do that. We learned a lot of lessons the hard way in Vietnam.
In spite of Viet Cong and NVA attacks, which hampered base operations both before and after Tet, the U.S. Air Force continued to carry the war to the enemy. And in the South, the primary mission was the support of U.S. ground forces. To bring in all the power of U.S. air support, it was first of all necessary to find the enemy. This was the job of the forward air controllers, who either flew low over the battlefield in slow single-engine prop planes, or else spent their time on the ground with the troops they called in the airstrikes for.
You had radios in that airplane so that you could talk to the people on the ground through FM radio. You also had HF radio. You could talk to your, we had enlisted people manning radios in our tactical operations center for the whole brigade. We could talk to them. We had VHF and we had UHF, so we could talk to the fighters. And you never knew what you were going to get, but they'd usually get it to you within 5 minutes.
From the perspective of the combat pilot, the assistance of the FAC was invaluable for providing accurate support.
We normally work with forward air control aircraft, and they would be under the direction of a regional aircraft or ground control agency. In Laos, of course, it was all airborne. In South Vietnam, it was normally ground controlled. You would have a target area, you would have an assigned target normally before you take off. You fly to a location, meet the forward air controller, he would normally mark the target with smokes, and then you would bomb in relation to those marks.
As they worked with the units on the ground, often in the same area for long periods, the FAC would develop a close working relationship with the commanders on the ground, and sometimes recognize when things were out of the ordinary.
I was up flying one day as my tour as a FAC when Archie ran into a whole battalion of North Vietnamese, and they just about had him. They were decimating his little group, and they were pinned down along a stream. So Arch called for me, and I knew who he was, and so I called in air, and while I was waiting for it, I went down to do all I could, and I had it's like an M16. It's called a Car 14. It's a collapsible stock M16, and I had a number of clips for that, and I expended every round I had. I shot every round out of my .38. I had some grenades in glass jars. They didn't work very well over there, but we drug them along anyway, and I threw those down there, you know, if I could get any kind of an explosion. I took a lot of hits, and I got a Silver Star for that. but I saved Arch Brown's life, probably, and those that were with him. That was really rewarding. Well, when the fighters showed up that day, I talked to the leader and I said, I got troops in real close contact down there. So if you've got new guys and you don't have confidence in them, you hold them high and dry and don't let them drop, because you're going to be dropping within 50 feet of them. And that's what they did that day. And they were really putting stuff in very, very close to that company. But as I say, they saved those guys' lives.
Troops in contact meant we were going in as close air support for some grunts who were pinned down or being attacked by the Viet Cong or the NVA there somewhere. So you felt like you were really doing something. You could see some results.
Flying in a slow single-engine plane close to the ground meant that the facts were vulnerable.
They knew the difference between the gray O-1s we flew, the Air Force ones, and the brown ones that the Army flew. They'd shoot a lot more at the Army than they would us, because they learned right away that if they shot at us just as we were flying over any particular point, that if we went into a circle, they'd probably end up being the recipients of an air attack, so they would never shoot at us until we were in that circle, and then they'd shoot at you because they figured you were waiting for the fighters to show up. Well, I was putting in a strike, and I went in to mark the target. I rolled in, and I had my hand on the stick and this hand on the throttle, and a round came up, probably a rifle bullet, through the bottom of the airplane. There was a fuel line right here, and it nicked the fuel line, so a spray of fuel came out, and the bullet went through a junction box, and sparks came out, which ignited the fuel. So now I got fuel under pressure being sprayed on me, and I'm on fire. And then the bullet came up and hit my watch and knocked my hand off the throttle for just a second. So it was burning my leg. This fuel was coming right on me. And the only thing that really saved my life, I think, is that it was so hot I wasn't wearing my big flak vest. I was sitting on it. So I just reached up and pulled that thing, and it's about that thick, pulled it up, and it deflected the fire. I got blisters on me, but that's all. And so I called the fighters and I said, hold high and dry, I'm hit. And they said, you sure are, you're on fire, and I was trailing smoke. But the nice thing about the Bird Dog is it had windows that opened out, and you could open the side window up, and there was a little thing it'd stay open up against the bottom of the upper wing. Same on this side, and I had both of those open. So I put it into a slip, and I headed for the ground, and so I could see, the smoke was, I could, in that slip is the only way I could see where I was going. And I got it down, and there was a road down there, and I thought, I'll land on that road. And I started to round out, and right in front of me was a big ox cart, a big son of a gun. And I thought, I don't want to hit that. So with my last gasp, I ruddered it over to the side of the road and put it in some real thorny stuff there. And it didn't tip over, it just came to a stop, probably within 10 feet. So I jumped out and got away from it, and I probably was only on the ground about, a minute or two, and a Huey came down, a helicopter, and got me out of there. Pretty exciting couple of minutes.
Fact duty was extremely hazardous, but absolutely essential to the success of tactical support of the ground troops in Vietnam. Close air support was the primary mission of the U.S. Air Force stationed inside South Vietnam.
There were about 4 basic missions of the attack airplane in Pleiku. First, we sat alert. We had 2 airplanes on alert at Pleiku for the SOG forces, which I think are studies and observation groups, which is a euphemism for the CIA and the special forces running around in countries they're not supposed to be in. If they got caught in trouble and they needed help, then we had 2 aircraft fully loaded on alert all day long, ready to go. That was a high priority mission. The other basic mission types, close air support, which is troops in contact, or interdiction, which is suspected locations, or lines of communication, which are roads, bridges, and fords, and things like that.
Our squadron did a lot of close air support, which was really great because since we were in country, we had almost always 4 airplanes that sat alert. We had 2 airplanes on hard alert, which carried usually 12 500-pound bombs each. And they were not on a real fast response alert. They were used for what were called commando sky spot missions, which were kind of vectored, and then you just dropped your bombs from straight and level at fairly high altitude. The other 2 airplanes were on rapid soft alert, and they carried, usually we carried napalm on the center and high drag bombs, which were what had fuses called daisy cutters, which were like, the fuses were like 4 or 5 feet long, so when the fuse hit the ground, the bomb would actually go off at ground level. In other words, not crater so much as be an anti-personnel weapon. But those 2 airplanes were on 2-minute alert.
One of the most durable and reliable aircraft available for close support was the A-1 Skyraider. This big, low-wing, propeller-driven airplane seemed like a throwback to an earlier age.
Climb in, start that baby up, and that was about the most fun of all because it's like starting 4 Harleys at one time. You turn the blade over about 16 times and then throw on the magneto switch, and the thing starts up with a just gigantic roar, and a big cloud of blue oil smoke comes out the back. Again, it was a radial, so it had stacks or exhaust pipes out the side of the aircraft in the bottom, and there were 2 rows of 9 cylinders, and they were big. It's 2,700 horsepower motor, single motor, and the prop was about 13.5 feet across, weighed 1,500 pounds, 4-bladed prop. And so when that started, it was just really cool. It's one of the nicest things about flying. I just lighten the motor up, and blum, 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 blum. Everything's going good. You go out to the end of the runway, get your clearance for takeoff. You do your run-up checks, check the magnetos. If there are any Army guys standing around on the ramp, we usually turn the magneto off just a hair longer and turn it back on and make the engine backfire and just scare the daylights out of them because it had a huge backfire. Probably didn't help the engine any, but we didn't worry about stuff like that. We were lieutenants. The A-1 was very versatile. That's one of the best things about it. It was the ability to carry almost any kind of ordnance, the ability to stay on target a long time, the ability to be very accurate. In the case of working with troops, you always figure out where they are, which way the wind's blowing, and try to line up perpendicular to the wind. And then you start strafing away from the troops and then bring your bullets over to wherever they are. And you could get probably within 10 meters of friendly troops with the 20-millimeter cannons. We could drop napalm back about 50 to 100 meters, and iron bombs had to be back about 1,000 feet because of the percussion and the risk of damage to the ears and things like that. One of the main weapons we carried was the 2-inch rocket, 2.72, whatever it is. And they come in tubes of 7 and 19. You can shoot 1 at a time, you can shoot 2 at a time, you can shoot a whole pod at a time. And so it really depends on the circumstances, and the most important circumstance is who's around. Normally you don't like to use rockets near friendly forces because you have no idea where they're going. And again, you've seen the pictures of them coming out of the tube and off to the side. And if you ripple fire a whole tube, you're almost guaranteed to see one go somewhere where you don't think it's going to go. So we had to always pay attention to what we were striking and what the conditions were. We always tried to find out what the enemy situation was because almost all the time we were opposed. But especially working around the troops, they were real sensitive. Go figure. And a lot of times they would decline to have support from the jet fighters because of the speeds involved. A lot of times their napalm would go all over the place. And so they were always glad to see the Sky Raiders because they knew that if they marked the target and they needed some help, we could bring it to them right there.
A typical problem encountered by aviators flying these close support missions was target fixation.
I was in South Vietnam one time, strafing a tree line at the bottom of a mountain toward the mountain with a little hooch or something back inside the tree line, and I couldn't quite make it out. And the forward air controller told us where it was, and I was strafing away, and just when I was ready to let up, I could see it. I said, I see it. So I just pulled it over a little bit and started hosing it down. Then I realized that was a little after I was planning to stop, and I let off the trigger and pulled up and just barely pulled up the face of the mountain without crashing. And that happened probably more than it should have.
Pilots had to constantly guard against this problem, and the F-4's 2-man crew configuration helped in that regard.
I was with one guy who got into a 90-degree dive one night, and he kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and 10,000 feet, we both started pulling. I said, I think we need to get out of here. So we started pulling, and we recovered at about 3,500 feet and pulled about 8 Gs in the pull-out doing that, because he had gotten into a almost exactly 90 degrees straight down like a tent peg, dive. So there's a good time to have a guy in the back seat on that one, there's no question. So, and on that sort of a thing, where on a bombing mission, that was one of the primary things that the backseater did was, keep track of what was going on and not over-concentrate, because close air support could be kind of, tenuous, especially if you added a little weather to that and a little ceiling and ground fire and all the rest of it. It kept your attention. You pretty well had to concentrate on what you were doing.
Normally you knew you were being shot at, but you couldn't tell. It took me probably about a month or two before I could see muzzle flashes and before I could see tracers during the day coming my way. You could always see your own going out, but you couldn't see other people shooting at you normally, unless they got into heavy anti-aircraft machine guns, which they had, or the anti-aircraft artillery.
During daylight, it was a lot of times we didn't know we were being shot at until the fact told us that we were being. He was down low enough where you could see him, knew where to look. At night, of course, you can see it, because I don't know what they used. Every third or fourth bullet probably was a tracer or something like that. In most cases, thank goodness, they weren't very good shots. They did not have very sophisticated fire control systems. A lot of times they were shooting at sound. But most of the time, if they had AAA that was forcing you down low, then of course it forced you down into the AAA, the smaller stuff, and the small arms fire. And the only hits we ever took, that I took personally, was small arms. Basically, we were down low enough to get hit by whatever, AK-47s or whatever. And very seldom. Didn't happen very often, which was just fine with me. Did our best to avoid that anyway.
The anti-aircraft artillery was a little better, especially at night, because I was in a night squadron the second 6 months. We'd fly out in northern Laos or central northern Laos, try to kill trucks, and all the truck routes had anti-aircraft positions along the way. And the 37 millimeter was a fairly good sized round, about a foot long or so, with a 37 millimeter size head on it, and they would have tracers and exploding heads, and they normally would time out at about 12,000 feet and explode. And they would have a clip of 7 rounds. And so they would stick a big old clip in the top of the gun, shoot it off, stick another one, shoot it off, and so forth, like you see in the World War II flicks on the boats sometimes, on the ships, where they drop a big bunch of rounds in the top of the gun. These were single-barrel cannons, and they had one guy cranking left and one guy cranking right. So that probably was part of the problem. They never could get coordinated. But they shot 1 million rounds and hardly ever hit anybody, especially at night. There were a few exceptions. But it was nice at night to be able to see these fired, because if you could track the golf balls, you count them and make sure they're all 7 there. Make sure they're all moving on a canopy, and if they're all moving, you can ignore them and look for more. It's only the one that's not moving that's on an exact collision course with the aircraft.
Close air support at night was essential in Vietnam, as the enemy often used the darkness to his advantage.
The difficult thing about those sort of missions were that it was, blacker than the inside of a cow, so to speak. You had very little light on the ground. You had some stars maybe sometimes you didn't. But a lot of times at night, they used what were called log markers, and those were just like a road flare, except bigger. But they'd put them out in the ground. You could see the red glow, and then you tried to estimate from there where to hit. It was very inexact. And we rolled in at a high altitude. We often rolled in from 14 to 18,000 feet. High angle bomb, 45-degree bomb, and then pulled out starting at about 8,000 feet. That way you'd bottom out before you got into small arms fire and all that sort of thing.
The close air support missions flown throughout the war were invaluable to the men on the ground and served to suppress localized enemy activity, but the need to attack larger target areas called for a different strategy. One of the most feared and most controversial weapons employed by the United States in Vietnam was the B-52 strategic bomber. Capable of delivering a devastating payload, the B-52 was perceived as Washington's most powerful bargaining tool.
We used the B-52 because it was available, because it was a bomber, And we thought that maybe if enough fear and enough trembling of the jungle, that somebody might give up.
No, it's a good airplane to fly. Actually, it was very responsive, not like a stick airplane. But that airplane at the time, that was the biggest airplane in the world. It was 500,000 pounds that you got up. And when it's full, it takes a long time to get it off the ground. We would take off out of Guam, fly for a while, hook up with the tankers, get the gas, and go on out to the target. Whatever the target happened to be at that time, it was all predetermined. Drive on into the target and drop the bombs and head back and grab some more gas and come on home.
Concern for the safety of the lumbering bomber limited its employment primarily to Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam, and caused the Air Force to use other planes as bait for the enemy.
We got these B-52s coming in, and they were bombing along DMZ, so they said, all right, you guys, you 102s, you're going to go up and be between them and the MiG threat. And if they shoot a SAM at you, then we'll know to send the B-52s away. So we would join up two 102s, and we would go ahead of the B-52s, but in the right time frame, so we looked like another B-52 from the radar.
A B-52 strike was impressive to those watching and devastating to anything in the area of impact.
They would just strip bomb an area. Nobody could tell the bombs were coming unless they had prior notice on the ground, until they started screaming in out of the sky, and then there's really no getting away from them because they carpet bomb. And I'm not sure how many bombs those B-52s carried, but it was probably in the hundreds. And there were 750 and 500-pound bombs, and a 500-pounder would make about a 10-foot crater, about 3 or 4 feet deep.
While some military leaders thought highly of these strikes against the South, others believed the B-52s were being used ineffectively and simply blowing holes in the jungle. It was this opinion that led the Johnson administration to begin bombing selected parts of North Vietnam in an attempt to destroy its infrastructure and cause its leadership to call off the rebellion in the South. Between March 1965 and November 1968, American airmen made regular attacks against the North as a part of an operation known as Rolling Thunder. But for political reasons, many important strategic targets were placed off limits.
We never allowed ourselves to go in to win the war because we were so scared of what Russia would do if we hit Hanoi. If we took Haiphong Harbor and destroyed it, which we should have done right from the very beginning, then maybe we wouldn't have had this thing escalate and continue like it did.
There's been a lot of criticism since the war that Johnson restricted the military far too much and that they could have won it if they'd just gone all out at the beginning. But what these criticisms miss is the fact that we had just come out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the world trembling on the brink of destruction, and Johnson had been right there, looking over Kennedy's shoulder when he'd looked down into that great big black bottomless hole that would be nuclear war. And whenever he decided on what he was going to do against North Vietnam, he had to face the possibility that it might bring in the Chinese, it might bring in the Soviets, and we might be right back to that brink, and that was somewhere that he quite properly did not want to go. In spite of the restrictions on the bombing, it was hard to find a large structure in North Vietnam, south of Hanoi, all the way down to the demilitarized zone, that had not been damaged or destroyed by the bombing. This bombing had provoked worldwide outcry and very strong protest in the United States, and after the Tet Offensive of 1968 and McCarthy's showing in New Hampshire, it became clear to the U.S. government that the war was going to have to be wound down. The North Vietnamese had demanded that all bombing of North Vietnam stop before they would enter peace talks, and as a result this was done, and the peace talks began in Paris.
The bombings of the North did not resume until 1972, when, in response to the North Vietnamese invasion of the South, President Nixon authorized a series of raids known as Linebacker 1. At first, these strikes were in support of the South Vietnamese forces, but later the restrictions against attacking North Vietnam were lifted. By the end of the year, Linebacker had evolved into a virtual non-stop bombing campaign against transportation and military infrastructure in Hanoi and Haiphong to try to bring an end to the war. The air war in the North presented the Air Force with its greatest challenge. As the strength and sophistication of the Vietnamese defenses increased greatly between Rolling Thunder and Linebacker, so too did the relatively simple Air Force tactics of 1965 evolve into the complex aerial ballet of the 1972 strike packages.
Early in the war, the Air Force fought its war in North Vietnam much as it had in Korea a decade earlier. The strikes were very simplistic. There was fighter escort, and then you had the bombers that were taking the target out. But by 1972, the air defenses in North Vietnam had become so sophisticated that it had forced the Air Force to develop strike packages of increasing complexity. So a typical strike in 1972 would incorporate an ECM package, a wild weasel package. These guys were the ones who suppressed the SAMs. You'd have the fighters covering the bombers going into the target. And these things all had to operate together in order for the strike to be successful.
The air war in Southeast Asia demanded accurate intelligence, most of which was gathered by reconnaissance aircraft. A variety of planes were employed over Vietnam, but perhaps the best suited was the RF-4C.
The RF-4C is a reconnaissance version of the F-4. Same airplane as the F-4C, only it was called the RF-4C because it carried an array of 4 different kinds of cameras. It had an oblique camera on both sides that would go out, say, 45 degrees left or right. It had a scanning camera that would scan horizon to horizon, had an high altitude camera, and it had an infrared camera. It was a very fully equipped airplane for 1966. And the airplane was equipped not only with those cameras, but it was equipped with the only terrain-following, forward-looking radar, and it had a terrain-following capability where you could just dial in the altitude you could fly, and you could fly it all weather, night, whatever, and it maintained that altitude above the ground. And we had a pilot in the back seat that was really taxed because he wasn't radar trained, and he had to learn in a hurry how to be a radar navigator, is what he was. And later, by the time I finished my tour in Vietnam, they were putting navigators in the back seat, which is what they should have had there all the time. And if you came out and say you were in a day mission, the target would be a single target in North Vietnam, and usually it was a JCS target number. You would get a little piece of paper with that target by coordinates and a time over target, and a requested coverage in what perspective they wanted the cameras to look. And that's all that was on that piece of paper. Most of our missions in the daytime were either pre-strike or post-strike. Well, if you were a pre-strike, if you were making pictures of the target before the strike fighters' forces hit it, you didn't want to be late, because you'd be right in the middle of all the bombs and all the missiles and all the things they were, because it didn't take a brain surgeon to see that hordes of airplanes coming from Thailand flying into the north. So they were certainly ready. So you were always on time for the pre-strike. Post-strike, we tried to be on time, but if anything, we'd be a little late because they had expended most all of their munitions, and the MiGs were all run out of fuel, and the SAMs had all been shot. And so you had an easier time of it if you were a little later there, if in anything. But we either had a pre-strike or post-strike time over target, and we just planned our mission to arrive over that target at that time, and we could get there in any way we wanted to. Most of the time, we'd go in at, as I told you, about Channel 97 in northern Laos, the TACAN station there. We'd go up there high altitude to conserve fuel, and then we'd start letting down. And our targets were so well defined by everybody in the world, they knew the targets too. And they knew that every day at 10 o'clock in the morning, there was going to be a strike, and they knew about 3 o'clock in the afternoon there was going to be another one. So they knew what time, and it wasn't hard to know with the list of targets once they started where they were going. And the reconnaissance airplanes were the same thing. They knew eventually where we was going to end up, so they just fired straight up in the air. And the airplane, of course, flies, let's fly right into it. It didn't take any lead, didn't take anything. And I think we lost most of our airplanes that way.
The information gathered by aerial reconnaissance, which went on day and night regardless of the weather, was used to design the strike package appropriate to a particular target. A wide array of American aircraft took part in the air war against North Vietnam. The fast and rugged Republic F-105 Thunder Chief played a vital role in many of the key operations of the war. Other aircraft, such as the F-102 Delta Dart and the North American F-100 Super Sabre, provided high cover for the strike aircraft, fending off sporadic MiG intercepts. The F-111 Aardvark and B-57 Canberra sustained the air campaign through even the worst weather conditions. But the most important and versatile plane in America's arsenal was the F-4 Phantom.
It's a multi-purpose aircraft, excellent plane, whether it was air-to-ground or air-to-air. Sort of a jack of all trades, but a master of none. It was a good aircraft. They made over 5,000 of them, and 11 or 12 different countries throughout the world ordered them and flew them. So it was a fine aircraft.
As far as strictly flying the airplane, it was not a particularly difficult airplane to fly. It didn't have any real nasty characteristics. Then, of course, the F-4 was a big, heavy airplane, common saying was if you put enough thrust behind a toilet, it'll go Mach 2, which was not very kind, but the F-4 was a pretty fast airplane, but you needed to learn to use a lot of rudder if you had any G's on the airplane, if it was loaded up with G's to turn the airplane. And as I said, probably the biggest problems with the airplane were the visibility. It was terrible from the back seat. You had mirrors, which is kind of a joke for seeing anybody behind you, but the visibility was not very good. The other problem was you could see the smoke trail of an oncoming F-4 miles before you could see the airplane. If you went into burner, the smoke trail went away, then you, of course, ran out of gas. So you had kind of between a rock and a hard place there. It was not a particularly great air-to-air airplane, just because it was good in the vertical. It was a good vertical fighting airplane, but in any sort of tight-turning, horizontal type thing, the MiG-21 was by far a much better airplane as far as strictly maneuverability. It was not a very good transonic airplane. The MiG wasn't, but the F-4 was very good there. We had, of course, much better fire control, radar, and a big laundry list of weapons we could carry there. For defensive stuff, we usually carried Sparrows, radar-guided missiles, air-to-air, and Sidewinders.
It was an aircraft that would fly under probably the worst situations. Very durable, very reliable. It was an expensive aircraft to maintain. It took a lot of man-hours per flying hour to keep the airplane working properly. A McDonnell Douglas airplane, I think we all talk about that particular aircraft is an aircraft that leaks a lot of hydraulic fluids, so that's always something that you're always concerned with. But that's okay. It served its country very well. Terrific airplane.
Unlike many of the fighters used in Vietnam, the F-4 carried a two-man crew. The second man, known as the Gib, or guy in back, assisted the pilot with the complex tasks of aerial combat.
The idea was, of course, that you were in training to be a aircraft commander, so you, in theory, did every other leg. But you did run all of the radar and looked for enemy aircraft. If you had to do ground mapping using the radar, you did that. You helped, of course, plan to the target, identify the target, did a lot of the radio work while the other pilot was flying. So pretty much co-pilot duties, except for the difference of you ran most of the radar intercept work.
In the aftermath of the Korean War, the Air Force believed that modern air combat would be fought at long range with guided missiles. Like many Air Force fighters of the day, the first F-4s did not have an internal gun system.
The big thinking was back in those days that, you'd have all this great radar and you'd intercept and flight at a distance far off and there wouldn't be a problem. Well, the problem was if you got in close, you couldn't do anything. You didn't have anything to shoot them with. You had to run into them. It was about the only thing you could do, which was not popular, needless to say. So they did design a gun pod that went on the center line, basically, of the F-4. C&D model. The big problem with that was, over there at least, is since they just strapped it to the airplane, when you would shoot it, it would be over there, or it would be over there, or sometimes it would be straight ahead, but not often. So you had to, and of course you had tracers so you could tell, but it was not a great weapon just because it often wasn't particularly accurate. Didn't have time to boresight it in over there all the time. So the E model with the internal gun is a lot better for that.
At Da Nang, if you were scheduled to fly a mission in South Vietnam, you would normally fly the F-4D model. If you were going to North Vietnam, then you'd fly the F-4E that had the 20mm cannon. If you happen to get into an air-to-air battle with various missiles that you had, there was a minimum range that the missile would be effective. So if you ended up getting too close, you couldn't fire a missile at him, so then you could use your 20mm cannon, whereas if you happen to be in the D model, you'd have to try to remaneuver to get at the appropriate range to be able to fire a missile. So they did not have the advantage at a longer distance, so obviously they would prefer to be in closer, and depending on the aircraft, its capabilities, there are certain regimes that one aircraft has an advantage over the other, so you try to maneuver your opponent into your area of advantage, and so the MiG aircraft would be more advantageous at a closer range and at certain altitudes and speeds as opposed to the F-4 or whatever aircraft you happen to be going up against.
When the MiGs began avoiding the F-4s, Air Force pilots began using innovative tactics to draw them into fights.
Robin Olds got very famous over there for taking the F-4 and making them resemble F-105s that were doing the real majority of the bombing in Hanoi. And he led flights of F-4s up there as if they were going on a bombing run to Hanoi, heavy with bombs, but these F-4s weren't. They were trying to entice the MiGs to come up, thinking that they were going up against F-105s, and actually the MiGs did come up, and Olds and his crews shot down, I think, 12 of them in one day.
As the airstrikes against the North increased in intensity and settled into a pattern, the North Vietnamese, assisted by Soviet and Chinese equipment and training, created a formidable multi-layered air defense system.
The AAA, those were the guns that looked like the flak guns in World War II that fire, and then you could see puffs all over the place where those things were going off. And they fired those at us at low altitude. They had so much firepower and so much munitions available, they fired at everything. It looked like a fireworks display when you flew up there at night. They would fly just from the sound. If there were so many sites around all those target areas that when they heard an airplane, they'd start firing. They'd shoot the Roman candle-looking things. About every fifth one's a tracer, and it just light the whole sky with those things. And they probably didn't even know where we were, most of them. The sound was very effective. The sound was only effective at a higher altitude, and if the aircrew didn't see it. I guess the easiest way to say that was I don't know of anybody that ever got hit by a sound that they saw it, because it was very easy to outmaneuver the sound. It left a great big dust cloud when it lifted off in the first place. It had an angle on the ground about like that, and we had warning indicators in the cockpit that told us when their radars was looking at us. We knew what kind of radar it was by the band of the radar, E-band, S-band, and we knew a strobe gave us a direction to look. And when it changed to a launch strobe, and you could right instantly, whether you wanted to or not, your eyes looked right over there. And when it lifted off, it left a big dust cloud because the engine ignited, and it was an angle like that. This blew dust all out the back, so you could see it when it came off the rails. And usually, what it would do is go up and get in its radar guidance, and then it would guide it to come down at the airplanes. But usually, when it would start down, we were taught how to maneuver such that it wouldn't be a problem. But we learned that most of the losses we had in those days were from ground fire, not SAMs and not MiGs, and not radar-controlled anti-aircraft. Most of the missions that we found that we were losing airplanes because of ZSU 23-4s and munitions that fired straight up in the air.
When an aircraft did go down, Air Force search and rescue units went to great lengths to extract the downed flyers.
We dedicated a significant percentage of our assets to getting our pilots back. And I think that's part of the way that America is. You know, in this country, we're all in the ruling class. We all get to vote, including guys that got shot down. And so every life is important. But if you're not idealistic, if you're not, you know, this is what we need to do, if you're just cold-blooded pragmatist, it takes a long time to train a pilot. And when the pilot's done with training, he still doesn't have those battle smarts. So if we can put some effort into search and rescue and get that guy back, so we keep that training and we keep all that battle sense, even if you're a heartless strategist, you're still going to want to do that. Well, in Vietnam, we go more and more into this, and it becomes very elaborate. We have dedicated aircraft that would suppress around the sites. We have jelly greens to pluck people out of the jungle. We have ABCCCs to coordinate all these things. And according to at least one author, sometimes we put so much time and effort to getting back a single pilot, we kind of lost the bubble on the larger offensives and things that were going on. You know, I wouldn't want to speculate on that, but at least in the larger context, it made very good military sense to get folks back so that both for humanitarian purposes and so that their expertise could be continued to be employed.
By the end of the war, the SAR package consisted of several layers of aircraft working together to save the downed airmen.
The standard hard search and rescue, the one that's opposed by a lot of ground fire, you would have 16 A-1s and a couple of helicopters and a bunch of jet fighters for heavy support. Normally for a difficult search and rescue, you'd have 4 aircraft that would drop white phosphorus marking smoke canisters down in a column toward the survivor. You'd have 4 that would drop canisters of CS riot control gas along the same corridor. Then you would have 8 aircraft, 4 on each side, flying a daisy chain, shooting and laying up napalm, firing rockets and guns. And they would provide a screen through which the helicopter would try to chug into the survivor, pick him up and come back out. And the other helicopter would wait back off in a safe area and either go back in if he had to or whatever. So a complicated search and rescue mission could be very congested. And when I mentioned the radios before, that's part of what I was talking about. If you have 16 aircraft all involved at the same strike, plus the helicopter pilots, plus the forward air controller and the airborne command post, plus a survivor on the ground, you have to have a lot of discipline on who says what and when to whom, and who you listen to and who you ignore. And that was the most challenging type scenario.
The level of activity that went along with search and rescue missions inevitably attracted the enemy's attention, and it was not uncommon for one or more aircraft involved in rescue operations to fall victim to hostile fire.
We were doing a weave up above, and we'd spent a fair amount of time there. We were about bingo on our fuel, and about time for us to leave, and so we were making a big turn to head out of the area, and 2 MiGs came up from a low altitude that nobody saw them. The controlling agency didn't see them. We didn't see them. And they fired 2 heat seekers, and both of them worked. So we actually had 4 guys down in the same general vicinity.
Although Aikman and the pilot of the other F-4 were successfully rescued, the backseaters in both aircraft were not so fortunate.
Tom Hanton was my backseater, and he steered his parachute into more or less of a clearing area. But by the time he got down to where he really wasn't able to maneuver anymore, he noticed that there were the North Vietnamese coming towards him where he was going to land. So he, within 5 minutes, he was captured. The pilot of number 3 aircraft was picked up right away. His backseater was also a POW for 9 months.
North Vietnamese treatment of captured airmen was far from ideal. Intense interrogation, beatings, solitary confinement, and attempts to use them in North Vietnamese propaganda efforts are well documented. The release of POWs eventually became a major demand by the U.S. government. At the end of January 1973, a peace treaty was signed by Henry Kissinger for the United States and Le Duc Tho for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Among other things, it provided for a speedy return of the POWs. With their repatriation in March of that year, the air war over the North had ended for the United States Air Force. As was done with the other branches of the military, the United States Air Force attempted to train and prepare South Vietnamese to take over aerial operations, but it was not an easy task.
South Vietnamese Air Force was a very dedicated group of people. There's no doubt they tried, but they didn't have all of the wherewithal or the resources to do it with. And we tried to give them the resources and let them take our resources and work them. And it just didn't come to fruition. It was too big, too immense for them to do that.
When the Air Force was first sent to the skies over Vietnam, it wasn't prepared or equipped for the mission it was being called upon to do.
We learned a lot in Vietnam. That's probably by far the best thing that came out of that conflict. We learned about putting guns on airplanes and keeping the visibility so if you got in close, you could see what you were doing. Lots of things that we have been incorporated in the F-15, the F-16, and the follow-on airplanes to the F-4. So for that reason, that part of it was very good for the United States.
The necessity for drastic evolution in tactics and weapons, coupled with the restrictions involved in the air campaign, led to frustration within the Air Force, just as it did in the other services.
Vietnam is a good illustration how not to use air power. And it's probably a good illustration how not to use naval forces, and it's a good illustration how not to use ground forces. And it's really an indication that how important strategists are. You have millions of people in the armed forces. Not all of them need to be strategists, but you really need at least a few.
Anytime, of course, you have the politicians running your war, you've got a serious problem. And because of the limitations, rules of engagement, the fact that we could not cross the border, even if, like I said, there was a convoy of trucks waiting for dark lined up on the other side of the border that you could see, and they're not there to, go to a swap meet. Let's face it, they're coming across the border. There was nothing you could do about that. You didn't go up there and, you'd be court-martialed.
One of our real aggravations, we didn't sink the ships in Haiphong Harbor. There's one harbor and two railroads leading in North Vietnam, and we were never allowed to bomb those. And that was an extremely important political mistake. To allow unlimited military supplies to the north, because that created this gigantic sieve of supplies moving south. And without the military supplies, the battle in the south could have been under much better control.
I think our frustration grew after we got back even more than it was when we were there. When we were there, you're so involved in the process of doing what you're retired to do, you just did it. You didn't have time to think about why in the world are we doing these dumb things? Why are we attacking this little small bridge between Hanoi and Haiphong when 5 or 7 miles away there's this airfield that's full of MiG fighters that we can't even touch?
We finally got them to quit in the 70s, by doing those very things, sending B-52s up there and sending and mining Haiphong Harbor. That finally got their attention.
I'm not so sure that it did. I think that North Vietnam recognized the fact that we had come to the end of our rope, and they knew that we needed some out that wasn't honorable but wouldn't be dishonorable either. And this is an opportunity to come to the table and let's just back out of this thing and we'll all look good.
We shouldn't have been there. I strongly believe that we just don't seem to learn. We should have known after Korea that if you're going to get in a war at all, you don't go in with this, get in with this. Everything you've got. We haven't learned that. We didn't learn it in Korea, We got into Vietnam and didn't learn it there. We didn't win that war. We didn't learn it at Desert Storm, and it looks like we're making the same mistakes right now.